They didn't help us in the Second World War. They didn't help us with Normandy. It took a matter of hours after Trump announced he was pulling out of northern Syria for the Turkish government to get planes in the air and bombs on the ground, ostensibly aimed at Kurdish targets. The same Kurds that were the primary fighting force against ISIS on the ground. The same Kurds the US themselves enlisted for assistance in the region. Not the same Kurds who were brutalised by Saddam Hussein's regime for decades, although I'm sure they're allies. The same Kurds who have answered the call from the Allies and NATO every time they've needed help in the Middle East, and not just for illegal wars based on dodgy advice about weapons of mass destruction. You see, the Kurdish people have never really had a modern home. They came pretty close way back in 1924 in the aftermath of World War I, when the British had formalised plans for the state of Kurdistan in the former Ottoman Empire region, intersected by eastern Turkey, northern Syria and Iraq, and western Iran. But the founder of modern Turkey, Kemal Ataturk, forced the renegotiation of these treaties after winning the Turkish War of Independence against Allied forces in that region. And this was even after the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. Back to the present though, where the first Turkish offensives began while the US media was still in its usual Trumpian tailspin, with leftist politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez claiming it was wrong to bring the troops home, while Trump's Republican allies adopted typical left-wing anti-war positions in claiming the US shouldn't police the world. Kurdish civilians and members of Syria's northern opposition were meanwhile fleeing on foot and in pickup trucks, with one politician from the Future Syria party being pulled out of her car and executed on the side of the road to Kamishli, which is a city on the Turkish border in Syria and home to the last remnants of government in the region. More than 60 civilians have been killed so far, and up to 800 foreign jihadis and their families have escaped a Kurdish-run prison camp after an airstrike by Turkey. Apparently, not a big deal for the man who claimed to have defeated ISIS, though, because they'll be escaping to Europe. Quote, that's where they want to go, unquote. It's hard to believe the leader of Australia's greatest ally can so callously disregard what was far and away their most important ally in the previously successful fight against ISIS and even the doomed war in Iraq. Apparently, a lot of Republicans agree too, although they'll probably be dismissed as typical war hawks, using a false equivalence between the Iraq and Afghanistan mistakes and the fight against ISIS, which, for the record, might share some common denominators but are being fought for very different reasons. ISIS was taking over the Middle East just like the old German Empire, and I don't think it's a strictly military-industrial position to say that they had to be stopped. Senator Marco Rubio, quote, the Kurds served as the primary ground fighters against ISIS in Syria at the request of this administration, unquote. Member of Congress Liz Cheney, quote, Turkish troops preparing to invade Syria from the north, Russian-backed forces from the south, and ISIS fighters attacking Raqqa. Real Donald Trump is leaving America's allies to be slaughtered, unquote. And the Kurds themselves, Mazlum Kobani Abdi, commander of the Syrian Democratic Forces, quote, if we have to choose between compromises and the genocide of our people, we will surely choose life for our people. The betrayal process is officially completed, unquote. And yet, for all the shame even right-wingers like Ben Shapiro are feeling about this abandonment of allies whose help the US asked for, or for what looks like domestic political purposes, it's not as simple as the pro-war, anti-war soundbites of the Bush years. For a start, Donald Trump was elected on a very clear platform of getting America out of foreign wars. So if any US president ever has had a license to bring the troops home, it's the Donald. And even with an American military presence, the Kurds have no state. You can't establish a state on top of the territory of states that already exist unless said state has a reasonable chance of existing into the future, like Israel. And with so many enemies in town, a Kurdish state just doesn't, at least not right now. The Iraqi Kurds have probably come closest in this regard, holding an independence referendum in 2017 that actually won majority support, but it was ruled illegal by whatever federal government still exists in Baghdad. So rather than start yet another endless civil war, the Kurdish government of the Iraqi province recognised that, quote, this decision must become a basis for starting an inclusive national dialogue between us and Baghdad to resolve all disputes, unquote. In the words of ScoMo, how good is that? It shows that they're one of the only ethnic groups in the entire Middle East that recognise they need to do things differently if they want to effect lasting change. It's also why I disagree with people like Tim Pool on the issue, who claim that the utterly unrealistic amounts of money the US spends on policing the world could be better spent on infrastructure at home, and that, quote, the reason I think many people support the Kurds is because they're very far left, unquote. For a start, that money is spent on people. If you deleted military spending overnight, you might be able to build a shitload of bridges and tunnels, but millions, literally millions of relatively well-paid Americans would find themselves unemployed overnight, leading to unimaginable economic consequences. And whether or not the Kurds self-determine as collectivist over individualist, they do it democratically, unlike a lot of their neighbours. But hey, if you'd rather have right-wing dictators in charge than left-wing democratically elected governments, well, just ask the CIA how well that worked out in South America over the last 50 years. Given the sheer number of troops and military assets the US has stationed all over the globe, Donald Trump should have left these 50 in place in northern Syria. It might have been the single cheapest military investment the US has ever made, and with comparatively outstanding results. The best return they've had on investment on their foreign policy in a very long time. He didn't even really bring them home. He just moved them out of the way of the Turks so that, guess what, the entire region can once again descend into firefights. If not providing assistance in the world wars is the bar, then Turkey also didn't meet that criteria. Remember President Erdogan's comments about Anzac troops on Anzac Day, a day when millions of former enemies pilgrimaged to Turkey to visit the sites of these slaughters in the name of empire building. Quote, your grandparents came here and they returned in caskets. Have no doubt we will send you back like your grandfathers, unquote. This is the NATO ally that the new anti-war right is so keen on defending over Kurdish collectivists that actually had our back. What is it with Donald Trump and stereotypical strongman leaders? I mean, it's one thing to prevent your countrymen and women from getting tangled up in a fresh foreign conflict. It is another thing entirely to leave your best asset in the fight against global Islamic terrorism to face multiple organised military forces alone the moment the heavy lifting is done. And so, we hear today that the Kurds have just signed an agreement with Syrian and Russian forces, allowing them into Kurd-controlled northern Syria. As their commander said, the betrayal is now complete. The Syrian regime and its Russian backers will now face off directly against Turkey, and no prizes for estimating pure chaos in the coming weeks and months. Given that we in Australia have followed the United States into every doomed foreign conflict they've dreamt up this last century, and the fact that our military assets are of little to no value, I'd no longer take for granted American assistance when it comes to maintaining peace and security in the Asia Pacific. The US just doesn't need allies. No state is ever going to attack them directly, and there's very little we can offer them in return for assistance, other than military legitimacy on the world stage. But regardless, it looks like they'll wash their hands of you once their interests have been served. With China now deciding it wants to police the world, all of this is very bad news for an island nation that can't even build a decent submarine. The US is definitely not perfect, but I'd rather live in a world policed by them than by China any day.